There's a clay tablet in the British Museum that archaeologists rarely discuss in public. It sits in drawer 47B, catalogue number K3751, covered in wedge-shaped impressions that tell an impossible story. The tablet lists 8 rulers who governed before a great flood swept the world clean. Their reigns weren't measured in decades or even centuries. The shortest ruled for 18,600 years, the longest for 43,200 years. Together, these 8 kings presided over human civilization for 241,200 years. Most scholars dismiss these numbers as a mythological exaggeration, symbolic rather than literal. But here's what makes this remarkable. When scientists compare modern human DNA to samples extracted from bones dating back just 10,000 years, they find something unexpected. Our ancestors possess genetic variations we've lost. Entire sequences of DNA that once existed in the human genome have simply vanished from the modern population. We're not just different from our distant ancestors, we're diminished. What if those impossible numbers on the clay tablet weren't mythology at all? What if they were documentation, written in a numerical system we no longer understand, recording an uncomfortable truth about what we once were and what we've become? The ancient Sumerians, who created the first cities and invented writing itself, left us more than myths. They left us medical procedures, astronomical calculations precise to track planetary orbits, and accounts of beings they called the Anunnaki, who they said descended from the heavens and created humanity through what reads remarkably like genetic engineering. These weren't primitive people recording fantasies. They were sophisticated astronomers whose mathematical system we still use to measure time. When they recorded 60 minutes in an hour and 360 degrees in a circle, they weren't guessing. So tonight, as the day fades and your thoughts begin to slow, I'm going to take you on a journey. Not to distant galaxies or alternate dimensions, but somewhere closer and perhaps more unsettling. Into the possibility that we are living as shadows of what humanity was designed to be. That somewhere in our deep past, crucial elements of human capability were deliberately switched off, suppressed, or bred out of our species. And that the keys to understanding what we lost might be hidden in the oldest stories we have, written by people who witnessed something we can barely imagine. Before we go deeper, if this resonates with you, a quiet like helps others find these stories. I'm curious. Where in the world are you drifting off from tonight? What time is it there? Feel free to share in the comments below. The visuals here are just context. You won't need them for this journey. Close your eyes if you'd like. Let the ancient world emerge in your mind's eye, in the space between memory and history, where the most profound truths often hide. Let's begin with what we know we've lost. In 2010, a team of researchers at the University of Adelaide published findings that shook the quiet corridors of evolutionary biology. They had analysed DNA from over 1,000 ancient humans whose bones spanned 45,000 years of history across Europe and Asia. What they discovered was evidence of more than 50 hard sweeps in the human genome. These are dramatic genetic events where a rare genetic variant rapidly spreads through an entire population because those without it die out. Think about what that means for a moment. More than 50 times in our species' history, the environment changed so drastically that only humans carrying specific genetic mutations survived to pass on their genes. Everyone else perished. These weren't gentle evolutionary nudges. They were catastrophic filters that wiped out entire genetic lineages. But here's the remarkable part. When the researchers compared ancient genomes to modern ones, they found that many of these hard sweep signals had been erased from the contemporary human population. The genetic diversity that once existed in our ancestors, the variations that allowed some of them to survive these catastrophic events, has largely vanished from modern humans. We're genetically more uniform now than our ancestors were 10,000 years ago. Around the same time, another research team made an equally startling discovery. They were studying ancient DNA from southern Africa and found people who lived there more than 400 years ago had dramatically different genetic makeups than any modern human population. The team described it as an extreme end of human genetic variation. These weren't a different species. They were anatomically modern humans, Homo sapiens, just like us, but their DNA was so distinct from ours that it suggests they had been isolated, evolving separately for upward of 100,000 years. What happened to them? Their genetic lineage didn't survive into the present. It simply ended. Then there's the curious case discovered in Colombia. Researchers found bones from people who lived in the Bogotá Altiplano around 6,000 years ago. When they sequenced the DNA from these remains, they discovered something that shouldn't be possible. The genetic signatures didn't match any other ancient or modern population in South America. These people appeared in the genetic record, built a civilization, transitioned from hunting and gathering to agriculture, and then vanished completely. No modern descendants, no genetic trace in living populations. They existed, thrived, and then were simply erased from the human story. Modern genetics shows us that our ancient ancestors had significantly more DNA than we do. Studies comparing human genomes to those of our closest evolutionary relatives reveal that before modern humans spread out from Africa, they lost approximately 15.8 million DNA base pairs. As populations migrated to different continents, more chunks of DNA disappeared. We didn't just evolve, we shed genetic information. Some of this lost DNA might have been vestigial, evolutionary dead weight. But not all of it. Scientists have identified sections of DNA that were duplicated in our ancestors, creating new genes that didn't exist in earlier hominids. These duplications affect more base pairs in the human genome than any other type of genetic change, and they tend to involve genes that carry instructions for making proteins, the fundamental building blocks of biological function. When we lose these duplicated sections, we lose capabilities. The academic explanation is straightforward. Genetic diversity decreases naturally as populations intermix, as dominant genetic variants outcompete others, and as populations go through genetic bottlenecks where only a small number of individuals survive to repopulate the species. It's a normal part of evolutionary biology. Except the pattern we're seeing isn't quite normal. The speed at which we've lost genetic diversity, the uniformity of modern populations compared to ancient ones, and the complete disappearance of certain genetic lineages suggests something more than natural selection at work. What if it wasn't just natural? What if there was a guiding hand deliberately selecting which genetic variations would persist and which would be allowed to die out? Let's return to that clay tablet in the British Museum, because the numbers recorded there tell a story that mainstream archaeology struggles to explain. The Weld-Blundell Prism, as it's officially known, is an 8-inch tall clay artifact covered on all four sides with columns of cuneiform script. It's one of the most complete versions of what scholars call the Sumerian king list, a document that purports to record every ruler of ancient Sumer from the moment kingship descended from heaven until around 1763 BCE. The list is organised into two distinct sections, divided by a single catastrophic event: before the flood and after the flood. The antediluvian section, the part describing rulers before the Great Deluge, lists 8 kings who ruled from 5 different cities. Their names are given: Alulim, Alalga, Enmenlu-ana, Enmengal-ana, the divine Dumuzid, Ensipa-ziana, Enmendu-ana, and Ubara-tutu. Alulim, the first king, ruled from the city of Eridu for 28,800 years. Alalga ruled for 36,000 years. Enmenlu-ana's reign lasted 43,200 years. When you add them all together, these 8 antediluvian kings ruled for a combined total of 200 years. Then the text states simply, the flood swept over. After the flood, the list continues with new kings and new cities. But something fundamental has changed. The reigns are different. The first king after the flood, ruling from the city of Kish, reigned for 200 years, still impossibly long by our standards, but a dramatic reduction from the tens of thousands of years recorded before. As you move down the list, the numbers continue to shrink. Eventually you reach names that historians can cross-reference with other archaeological evidence, kings whose reigns match plausible human lifespans. Gilgamesh, the legendary king of Uruk, appears on the list with a reign of 126 years. Still extraordinary, but within the realm of extreme possibility. By the time the list reaches its conclusion, the reigns have settled into normal human spans of decades rather than centuries. This progression is what makes the Sumerian king list so compelling. If the entire document were fantastical mythology, why would the pattern change so dramatically at the flood? Why not maintain the extraordinary numbers throughout? The list seems to be documenting a transition, a fundamental shift in the nature of human existence. Mainstream scholars offer several explanations. The most common is that the enormous antediluvian numbers are symbolic, representing political legitimacy by connecting historical dynasties to an impossibly ancient past. The Sumerians used a base 60 mathematical system, counting in multiples of 60 rather than our base 10 system of multiples of 10. Some researchers have suggested that the numbers might have been recorded incorrectly, that a scribe converting from an earlier decimal system to the sexagesimal system might have multiplied everything by 60, inflating normal human lifespans into these impossible figures. One scholar, Raul Lopez, has argued that if you divide the antediluvian reign lengths by a factor of 60, and then compare them to the ages given in the biblical Genesis account of the patriarchs before the flood, the numbers align remarkably well. What the Sumerians recorded as 28,800 years could have been 480 years, still extraordinary, but closer to the 900-year lifespans recorded in Genesis for figures like Adam and Methuselah. But here's what's fascinating. The Sumerian king list isn't unique. Parallel traditions exist in completely unrelated cultures. The biblical Genesis account does describe patriarchs living for hundreds of years before the flood, with lifespans dropping precipitously afterward. Ancient Egyptian king lists record pharaohs ruling for thousands of years in the distant past. Hindu traditions speak of rulers during different yugas, or ages, living for tens of thousands of years. Japanese imperial chronicles claim early emperors ruled for over a century. These stories span different continents, different languages, different writing systems, and different cosmologies. Yet they all share the same basic pattern. Rulers or important figures in the distant past lived far longer than any modern human. Then something changed, and lifespans crashed to normal levels. From the mainstream perspective, this is simply evidence of a universal human tendency to mythologize the past, to imagine a golden age when heroes were greater, wiser, and lived longer than we do now. It's poetry, not history. But what if these accounts are fragmented memories of something real? What if there was a time when certain humans did live for centuries, not through magic or mythology, but through biological engineering? And what if the flood that divides the antediluvian period from the post-diluvian isn't just a massive deluge of water, but a metaphor for a catastrophic reset, a moment when the old world ended and a new, diminished humanity emerged? The Sumerians left us more than king lists. They left detailed creation accounts, stories of how humanity came to be, and when you read these texts without the filter of assuming they're primitive mythology, they read remarkably like descriptions of genetic engineering. The most complete version of the Sumerian creation story comes from a text called Atra-Hassis, named after the flood hero who appears in it. Later versions were preserved in Babylonian and Akkadian, but the core story is Sumerian, dating back to at least 1800 BCE, and likely based on much older oral traditions. The story begins not with humans, but with the gods, specifically with a labour dispute. The Anunnaki, described as the great gods, the princely offspring who came from the heavens, had established operations on Earth. They needed to perform massive infrastructure work, digging out the beds for the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, creating irrigation canals, building cities. This work was assigned to a class of lesser gods called the Agigi. For what the text describes as 40 years, 3,600 years, or 40 sars depending on the translation and manuscript, the Agigi performed this back-breaking labour. Finally, they could take no more. They burned their tools, surrounded the house of Enlil, the chief administrator of the Earth Project, and went on strike. They refused to work any longer. The Anunnaki Council convened to address the crisis. Enlil, true to his authoritarian nature, wanted to punish the rebels severely. But Enki, his half-brother, the god of wisdom and fresh water, proposed a different solution. Instead of punishing the Agigi, he suggested they create a substitute workforce, a new being designed specifically to perform the labour the Agigi refused to do. And here's where the story becomes remarkable. The text describes the creation of this being, called the Lulu, the Mixed One, in explicit detail that sounds nothing like divine magic and everything like a biological engineering procedure. First, they needed raw material. Enki called for clay to be taken from the Abzu, his domain of subterranean fresh water. But this wasn't just any clay. It had to be pure, mixed with the essence of the earth. This would be the base, the biological template. But the new creature needed more than form. It needed intelligence, the capacity to understand and follow instructions. For this, the text says, a god had to be sacrificed. A deity named Geshtue, described as having intelligence, was selected. His essence, specifically described as his blood and his spirit, was to be mixed with the clay. The mother goddess Nintu, also called Ninosag, was assigned the task. She took the divine essence and mixed it with the clay from the Abzu. The text describes her dividing this mixture into 14 portions. 7 were used to create males, 7 for females. But here's the detail that makes modern readers sit up. These portions weren't simply animated, they were implanted. The text describes 14 womb goddesses, birth goddesses, who received these prepared samples and carried them through a gestation period. After the appointed time, Nintu announced her success. The first humans were born. Read that sequence again. Taking genetic material from one species, a primitive hominid, the clay from Earth, mixing it with genetic material from another species, the blood and essence of Geshtui, implanting the resulting hybrid into surrogate mothers, waiting for a gestation period, the birth of a new species. This isn't metaphor. This isn't poetic language about divine breath animating clay. This is a step-by-step description of in vitro fertilization and genetic manipulation. The only reason we don't immediately recognize it as such is because the Sumerians didn't have words for DNA, embryo, genome, or laboratory. They used the vocabulary they had. Clay for biological material, divine blood for genetic essence, birth goddesses for surrogates. The text is explicit about the purpose of this creation. The Lulu were designed to bear the workload of the gods. They were created as a slave species, intelligent enough to understand complex tasks, but engineered specifically to serve their creators without question. This account, recorded in cuneiform on clay tablets that survived in the ruins of ancient Mesopotamian cities, predates the biblical Genesis account by at least 1,000 years. And while Genesis simplified the story, describing God forming Adam from the dust of the ground and breathing life into him, the underlying structure is the same. Humanity was created by a higher intelligence using the raw material of Earth combined with a divine element. Zecharia Sitchin, the controversial author who brought the Anunnaki narrative to popular attention in the 1970s, proposed that this story wasn't mythology at all. He argued that the Anunnaki were a physically real species, extraterrestrial visitors from a planet called Nibiru, whose elliptical orbit brought it through our solar system every 300-600 years. These beings, he claimed, came to Earth approximately 450,000 years ago, established mining operations to extract gold needed to repair their planet's deteriorating atmosphere, and when their worker population rebelled, they genetically engineered Homo sapiens by combining their own DNA with that of Homo erectus, a hominid species already evolving on Earth. Mainstream scholarship has thoroughly rejected Sitchin's theories, pointing out that his translations of Sumerian and Akkadian texts are often idiosyncratic, that he quotes passages out of context, and that he imposes a modern technological framework onto ancient spiritual narratives. The academic consensus is clear. The Anunnaki were gods, deities in the Mesopotamian pantheon. The creation stories are theological and mythological, not historical documentation of genetic engineering. But here's what the mainstream dismissal doesn't quite explain. Why would ancient scribes, practical people who used writing primarily for accounting and administration, tracking grain supplies and calculating taxes, invest enormous effort in creating elaborate fantasies? Why describe the creation process in such specific procedural detail if it's pure invention? And there's another question. If these stories are mythology, why do they include elements that only make sense in light of modern genetic science? The Sumerians couldn't have known about DNA, couldn't have understood heredity in molecular terms, couldn't have conceived of genetic hybridization. Yet their creation account describes taking material from 2 different sources, combining them in a controlled environment, implanting the result in surrogates, and producing viable offspring. That's not how the ancient people typically imagined creation. That's how modern scientists actually create transgenic organisms. If we entertain, even hypothetically, the possibility that the Sumerian accounts contain distorted memories of real genetic engineering, what capabilities might have been deliberately designed into early humans and then later suppressed or bred out? Let's start with the most obvious: longevity. The pattern documented in both the Sumerian king list and the biblical Genesis is unmistakable. Extremely long lifespans before the flood, dramatically shortened afterward. If the Anunnaki created humans as a worker species, long lifespans would make practical sense. training a workforce is expensive and time-consuming. A human who lives for 900 years and remains productive for 800 of them represents a much better return on investment than one who lives for 80 years with perhaps 50 productive years. Modern genetics has identified genes that regulate aging and lifespan. The FOXO3 gene, for instance, is strongly associated with longevity in multiple human populations. People with certain variants of this gene live significantly longer than average and show reduced rates of age-related disease. There are genes that regulate cellular senescence, the process by which cells stop dividing and contributing to tissue repair. There are genes involved in telomere maintenance, the protective caps on chromosomes that shorten with each cell division, like a biological countdown timer. What if early humans were engineered with optimal versions of these genes? What if their telomeres were designed to shorten much more slowly, or even to regenerate, allowing cells to divide many more times before reaching senescence? What if their cellular repair mechanisms were enhanced, their resistance to oxidative damage increased, their susceptibility to age-related protein misfolding reduced? You could engineer a human to live for centuries using genetic tools that, at least theoretically, we're developing right now. We're still decades away from actually doing it, but the science is sound. Modify the right genes, and you extend lifespan. Not infinitely, there are hard limits imposed by physics and entropy, but certainly far beyond our current 80-year average. Now consider what happened after the flood. In the Atrahasis epic, after the deluge recedes and the surviving humans emerge, the text describes Enlil, the administrator who originally wanted humanity destroyed, making a decree. He establishes new rules for human civilization, and buried in those rules is a curious detail. He institutes death, sickness, and limits on fertility. He specifically states that humanity will no longer live as long as before. If we read this literally, rather than symbolically, it describes a deliberate biological intervention. The long-lived variety of humanity is gone, swept away by the flood. What remains is a modified version with built-in limitations, shorter lifespans, increased susceptibility to disease, controlled fertility. This could be accomplished through selective breeding. You don't need to perform surgery on every human, you just need to ensure that only the humans with the genes you want reproduce. Within a few generations, the long-lived genetic variants are gone from the population. The hard sweep is complete, but longevity might have been the least of what was lost. Deep in the center of your brain, nestled between the two hemispheres, sits a small pinecone-shaped gland about the size of a grain of rice. Modern medicine knows it primarily as an endocrine organ that produces melatonin, regulating your sleep-wake cycle. But to ancient cultures across the world, this tiny structure was something far more significant. It was the seat of the soul, the third eye, the gateway between physical reality and spiritual dimensions. The ancient Egyptians called it the Eye of Horus. Hindu tradition identifies it with the Ajna chakra, the center of intuition and insight. Buddhist practices focus on it as crucial for meditation and spiritual awakening. The philosopher René Descartes believed it was the principal seat of the soul, the point of connection between mind and body. Even Jesus, in the Gospels, makes a cryptic reference that some scholars interpret as relating to this organ. The eye is the lamp of the body. If your eye is healthy, your whole body will be full of light. Why did so many completely unconnected traditions fixate on this particular part of the brain? Because unlike most brain structures, the pineal gland is singular. You don't have a left and right pineal gland like you have left and right hemispheres. It sits alone at the center, outside the blood-brain barrier, making it uniquely susceptible to chemicals in the bloodstream, but also uniquely positioned to integrate information from both sides of the brain. Evolutionary biology tells us the pineal gland is a vestigial third eye, a photoreceptor that in ancient vertebrates sat exposed on top of the skull, detecting light directly. Some modern reptiles still have this structure, a literal third eye on top of their head that helps regulate circadian rhythms. In mammals, including humans, this structure migrated deep into the brain and transformed, but it retained photosensitive cells and maintains deep connections to the visual system. Here's where it gets interesting. The pineal gland produces more than just melatonin. Researchers found that it also synthesizes small amounts of dimethyltryptamine, DMT, often called the spirit molecule. This is one of the most powerful psychoactive compounds known to science, capable of producing profound alterations in consciousness, vivid hallucinations, and what users consistently describe as encounters with otherworldly entities and dimensions. The pineal gland produces DMT during extreme physiological states, possibly during birth, definitely during death, and potentially during deep meditative states. The exact function of endogenous DMT production remains mysterious, but its association with the pineal gland and its effects on consciousness have led to intense speculation about the gland's role in psychic phenomena. Esoteric traditions maintain that an activated, healthy pineal gland enables abilities that modern science classifies as paranormal. Clairvoyance, the ability to perceive information beyond ordinary sensory input. Telepathy, direct mind-to-mind communication without speech. Precognition, sensing future events before they occur. Astral projection, the experience of consciousness separating from the physical body and travelling to other locations or dimensions. Mainstream science dismisses these claims as pseudoscience, pointing out that there's no verified evidence of psychic abilities under controlled laboratory conditions. Every time someone claims to have telepathic or precognitive abilities and agrees to formal testing, they fail to perform better than chance. Psychic phenomena, according to the scientific consensus, don't exist, but here's a curious historical footnote. During the Cold War, both the United States and the Soviet Union invested heavily in parapsychology research. The CIA ran programs with names like Stargate, investigating whether remote viewing, the ability to psychically perceive distant locations, could be developed as an intelligence-gathering tool. The program ran for over 20 years and cost millions of dollars. The official conclusion, released when the program was declassified, was that remote viewing showed some statistically significant results but was too unreliable for practical intelligence use. Too unreliable doesn't mean impossible, it means inconsistent. And that raises an interesting possibility. What if psychic abilities aren't fantasy, but rather dormant capabilities that most modern humans can't access because the biological structures that enable them have been compromised? The compromise has a name: calcification. Studies using CT scans and MRI imaging have found that the majority of adults over the age of 18 have calcified pineal glands. Calcium deposits, sometimes with phosphate and fluoride, accumulate in the gland, forming a hard shell around the tissue. The more calcified the pineal gland, the less melatonin it produces, and presumably the less DMT and other neurochemicals that might facilitate expanded states of consciousness. What causes this calcification? The research points to several factors. Fluoride in drinking water and dental products is strongly associated with pineal calcification. The gland sits outside the blood-brain barrier, making it uniquely vulnerable to accumulating toxins from the bloodstream. Dietary calcium from processed foods, particularly calcium phosphate additives, contributes to the buildup. Electromagnetic radiation from wireless devices and electrical fields may interfere with the gland's function, and simply not using the capacities the gland might enable allows it to atrophy and calcify. Ancient Egyptian texts describe the pineal gland of adepts, spiritual practitioners who underwent intensive training, as being the size of a peach rather than a pea. Modern humans have pineal glands that are, on average, significantly smaller and heavily calcified compared to what the organ's full potential might be. If the Anunnaki engineered humans as a worker species, they would have had an incentive to suppress abilities that might allow their creations to communicate telepathically, to perceive events remotely, to access higher states of consciousness that might lead to questioning their servitude. The easiest way to do this wouldn't be to remove the pineal gland entirely, that might have caused other physiological problems. The elegant solution would be to introduce environmental and dietary factors that cause the gland to calcify naturally, to limit its function without eliminating it completely. And if you wanted to ensure this calcification occurred in subsequent generations, you would establish it as a standard practice. Introduce fluoride into the water supply, ostensibly for dental health. Promote dietary habits that lead to calcium accumulation. Create a technological society that bathes everyone in electromagnetic radiation. Frame meditation and psychic development as superstition or fantasy, ensuring that people never attempt to activate and exercise the capacities the pineal gland might enable. The conspiracy theory claims that this is exactly what happened. That world governments, possibly still in contact with or taking direction from the Anunnaki, have implemented a systematic program to keep human consciousness suppressed. Fluoride in the water, processed foods designed to calcify the pineal gland, constant electromagnetic interference, and cultural programming that ridicules any suggestion of psychic abilities. But you don't need a vast conspiracy for this to occur. If the original genetic engineering included a vulnerability to calcification, if early post-flood humans discovered that certain environmental factors promoted it and embedded those factors into their civilization, the process would be self-sustaining. Each generation would unwittingly continue the suppression, believing they were simply following sensible health and technological practices. What would an uncalcified, fully functional pineal gland enable? We can only speculate based on scattered reports from meditators, mystics, and the few people who claim to have activated their third eye. They describe experiencing reality as fundamentally interconnected, perceiving time as non-linear, with past, present, and future existing simultaneously, accessing information without using the ordinary senses, and communicating with consciousness that exists outside physical form. Whether you interpret these experiences as genuine expansions of consciousness or as chemically induced hallucinations depends on your framework. But it's worth noting that these reports are remarkably consistent across cultures and time periods. People who've never heard of each other, separated by continents and centuries, describe essentially the same experiences when their pineal gland is activated through meditation, psychedelic compounds, or near-death experiences. The pineal gland and longevity are just the beginning. If we're cataloguing what might have been deliberately removed from human potential, the list grows extensive when you compare ancient accounts to modern capabilities, physical strength and resilience. Ancient texts across multiple cultures describe heroes and warriors with superhuman strength. Samson in the Hebrew Bible, who killed a lion with his bare hands and brought down a building by pushing its pillars. Enkidu in the Epic of Gilgamesh, who wrestled with animals and matched the two-thirds divine Gilgamesh in combat. Heracles in Greek mythology, performing 12 labours that required strength far beyond normal human limits. We dismiss these as exaggerated stories about exceptional individuals, but archaeological evidence shows that ancient humans were, on average, significantly more physically robust than modern populations. Skeletal remains from hunter-gatherer societies show bone density and muscle attachment points that indicate far greater physical strength than the average modern human. The transition to agricultural civilization and then to industrial society has made us progressively weaker, more sedentary, more physically fragile. Some of this is environmental. Modern humans don't need to hunt, fight, or perform hard manual labour for survival. Our bodies adapt to the demands placed on them, and we place relatively few physical demands on ourselves, but genetics plays a role too. The genes that code for muscle fibre type, bone density, and physical endurance exist in different variants across human populations. Some variants are associated with explosive strength, others with endurance, others with flexibility and coordination. What if the original engineered humans were given optimal variants of all these genes? What if they were designed with muscle fibre distributions that maximize both strength and endurance, with bone structures that could withstand enormous stress, with connective tissue that was nearly impervious to damage? You would create workers who could perform strenuous physical labour indefinitely, without breaking down. After the flood, after the supposed reset, these genetic variants could have been selectively bred out. Humans strong enough to rebel, to resist, to pose a physical threat to their creators would be eliminated. Only the more docile, physically weaker variants would be allowed to survive and reproduce. Healing capacity. Multiple ancient traditions describe accelerated healing, the ability to recover from injuries that would kill or permanently disable a modern human. The Epic of Gilgamesh mentions a plant that restores youth. Greek myths describe the healing temples of Asclepius where miraculous cures occurred. Hindu texts reference powerful herbs and practices that could regenerate lost limbs. Again, we dismiss these as fantasy. But modern research into regenerative medicine reveals that humans retain dormant capabilities for healing that are normally suppressed. Children, particularly young children, can regrow fingertips if they're amputated at the right point. The younger the child, the more complete the regeneration. Adult humans can't do this. The genetic programs that enable cellular regeneration are shut down early in development. Some salamanders can regenerate entire limbs, complete with bone, muscle, nerve and skin, growing a perfect replacement after amputation. The genes that enable this exist in the salamander genome. Humans have orthologous genes, similar genetic sequences that serve related functions, but in humans these regenerative programs are turned off. They're there in our DNA, just not active. What if they used to be active? What if early humans could heal catastrophic injuries, regenerate damaged organs, resist infection and disease with far greater efficiency than we can now? Deactivating these capabilities would serve the same purpose as shortening lifespan. It makes the workforce more dependent, more fragile, less likely to survive rebellion or escape. Cognitive ability and memory. This one is the most controversial because it challenges our assumptions about human progress. We believe we're smarter than our ancestors, that civilization represents an upward trajectory of increasing intelligence and capability. But the evidence is mixed. Recent studies analysing ancient DNA and comparing it to modern genomes have found that ancient humans, living just 4,000 years ago, showed no significant difference in the genetic markers associated with intelligence compared to modern populations. Their brains were just as capable as ours. The raw hardware was the same. But here's what's different. Modern humans outsource enormous amounts of cognitive function to technology. We don't memorize information because we can look it up instantly. We don't perform complex calculations because we have devices that do it for us. We don't navigate by landmarks and spatial memory because we have GPS. We don't maintain vast oral traditions because we have written records. Ancient peoples, lacking these technological crutches, developed cognitive capabilities we've largely lost. Oral cultures maintained genealogies spanning dozens of generations, epic poems, tens of thousands of lines long, detailed astronomical observations spanning centuries, all committed to memory with perfect accuracy. Indigenous peoples could navigate trackless wilderness using subtle environmental cues we can't even perceive. Some cultures had vocabularies for colours, plants and animals that were far more nuanced and extensive than modern languages. These aren't different genetic capabilities. They are the same brains used differently. But it suggests that the human brain has a far greater capacity than we typically access. We use a small fraction of our cognitive potential, and we've structured our civilization in ways that actively discourage developing that potential. Intuition and pattern recognition. Before we had scientific instruments, humans navigated by feeling the patterns in nature. Sailors could predict weather changes from the colour of the sky and the behaviour of seabirds. Trackers could reconstruct the entire story of an animal's movements from subtle disturbances in vegetation. Healers could diagnose illness from changes in skin colour, smell, and energetic presence that no modern diagnostic tool can detect. We call this folk wisdom, traditional knowledge, sometimes primitive superstition, but it represents a form of holistic, intuitive information processing that modern reductionist, analytical thinking has largely displaced. We've trained ourselves to ignore hunches, to dismiss gut feelings, to trust only what can be measured and quantified. If humans once possessed enhanced intuitive faculties, the ability to sense danger before it materialized, to read emotional and intentional states in others without verbal communication, to perceive patterns in chaos that our conscious analytical mind can't process, these abilities would be threatening to controllers. A workforce that can sense when they're being deceived, that can communicate without speech, that can anticipate and avoid danger, would be much harder to manage. The suppression wouldn't require genetic modification. It could be accomplished through cultural programming. Teach people to distrust their intuition, frame pattern recognition and gut feelings as irrational and unreliable, reward analytical thinking and punish intuitive leaps. Within a few generations, even though the capability remains latent in the neurology, people would learn not to access it. If we accept, even hypothetically, that humans were engineered with capabilities that have since been suppressed or removed, we need to ask how such suppression could be maintained across thousands of years and billions of people. The answer lies in understanding that control mechanisms, once established, become self-perpetuating systems that don't require ongoing active management. Genetic drift and selective pressure. The simplest mechanism is just allowing unfavourable genetics to die out naturally. If you create an environment where certain genetic traits confer a survival advantage and others create a disadvantage, evolution does the work for you. Humans with extremely long lifespans would have been rare after the flood. If they didn't reproduce as successfully as shorter-lived variants, perhaps because their offspring took too long to reach reproductive maturity, or because the post-flood environment created specific challenges they couldn't adapt to, their genetic lineage would naturally diminish over generations. This is standard evolutionary biology. You don't need a conspiracy, you just need differential reproductive success over time. Environmental toxins and dietary factors. We've already discussed fluoride and pineal gland calcification, but the principle extends further. If the original genetic engineering included vulnerabilities to specific environmental factors, you could suppress abilities simply by ensuring those factors are present in the environment. Imagine that enhanced psychic abilities require a specific neurochemical balance that's disrupted by heavy metal accumulation in brain tissue. You don't need to force people to ingest heavy metals, you just need to allow industrial processes that release lead, mercury, cadmium, and aluminum into the environment. Over time, everyone accumulates these toxins simply by breathing air, drinking water, and eating food. The abilities shut down automatically. Or consider that regenerative healing requires specific nutritional cofactors that were abundant in the ancient diet, but scarce in modern processed foods. You don't need to ban these nutrients. You just need to create an agricultural and food processing system that removes them naturally. People eat the food available to them, deficiencies develop, healing capacity diminishes. This is plausibly deniable suppression. There's no smoking gun, no deliberate program to identify and suppress. Just environmental and dietary changes that happen to disable dormant capabilities, cultural programming and belief systems. This is perhaps the most insidious because it makes people suppress their own abilities without any external force required. If you can convince people that psychic abilities don't exist, they'll never attempt to develop them. If you can establish a cultural framework where scientific materialism is the only acceptable worldview, where anything not measurable and reproducible is dismissed as superstition, people will actively reject experiences that fall outside that framework. Someone who experiences telepathy will rationalize it as coincidence. Someone who has a precognitive dream will explain it as déjà vu or selective memory. Someone who perceives energy fields or auras will convince themselves they imagined it. The abilities might activate spontaneously, but the cultural programming ensures they're immediately dismissed and suppressed. This doesn't require a conspiracy. It just requires a few influential thought leaders, scientists, educators, religious authorities who genuinely believe in a materialist framework and teach it as truth. Their students adopt the same framework, teach it to the next generation, and within a few cycles, the entire culture operates under assumptions that make certain abilities literally unthinkable. Institutional gatekeeping. Any ability that does manifest gets channeled into controlled institutions. Healing abilities become medicalized, restricted to licensed practitioners using approved methods. Intuitive pattern recognition gets dismissed as luck or heuristics unless it can be formalized into an algorithm. Spiritual experiences get pathologized as hallucinations or mental illness unless they occur within sanctioned religious contexts. This creates a system where even if abilities begin to activate, they're either suppressed, explained away, or captured and controlled by institutions that limit how they can be expressed. Technological dependency. The more we outsource cognitive and physical functions to technology, the more those innate capabilities atrophy. If you never need to remember anything because you have a smartphone, your memory systems weaken. If you never need to navigate intuitively because you have GPS, your spatial orientation abilities degrade. If you never need to communicate telepathically because you have instant messaging, whatever neurological structures might support mind-to-mind communication never develop. Technology isn't evil, it's enormously useful, but it has the side effect of making certain human capabilities obsolete. And capabilities that aren't used, that provide no survival or reproductive advantage, tend to be lost over generations. The beauty of these mechanisms is that none of them requires ongoing deliberate control. Once set in motion, they're self-sustaining. Genetic drift happens automatically. Environmental toxins accumulate naturally in an industrial civilization. Cultural beliefs propagate through education and socialization. Institutions maintain their own structure and authority. Technology advances because it's profitable and useful. If the Anunnaki wanted to ensure that humanity remained limited, they wouldn't need to maintain direct oversight. They would just need to engineer the initial conditions and let human civilization develop along predictable trajectories. The suppression would maintain itself. Before we go further down this speculative path, it's important to acknowledge the substantial evidence against the ancient astronaut theory and the idea that human abilities have been deliberately suppressed. First, there's no physical evidence of the Anunnaki as extraterrestrial visitors. We have their names in ancient texts, descriptions of their actions, accounts of their technology, but we don't have crashed spacecraft, alien artifacts, or genetic markers in human DNA that clearly indicate extraterrestrial origin. Every artifact that ancient astronaut theorists point to as evidence of advanced technology, ziggurats, megalithic structures, intricate astronomical knowledge, can be explained through human ingenuity and long-term observational effort. The Sumerians were brilliant. They invented writing, created sophisticated mathematics, developed astronomy and agriculture and law, but nothing they accomplished requires us to invoke alien intervention. Humans are fully capable of achieving these things given enough time, resources, and motivation. Second, the translations that support the ancient astronaut theory are controversial. Mainstream Assyriologists, scholars who dedicate their careers to studying ancient Mesopotamian languages and texts, nearly universally reject Zecharia Sitchin's interpretations. They argue that he mistranslated key words, took passages out of context, and imposed modern technological concepts onto ancient religious and mythological narratives. The word Anunnaki most likely means princely offspring or those of royal blood, denoting their status as the children of the sky god Anu and the earth goddess Ki. It doesn't mean those who from heaven came to earth in a literal extraterrestrial sense. The creation accounts describe divine magic, not genetic engineering. The numbers in the Sumerian king list are symbolic or corrupted, not literal records of thousand-year lifespans. When experts who understand the language, the culture, and the context nearly unanimously reject an interpretation, we should take that seriously. Third, the genetics don't support the idea of recent extraterrestrial intervention. Human DNA shows clear evolutionary descent from earlier hominids. We share 98.8% of our genome with chimpanzees. We have genetic markers that trace our ancestry back through Homo erectus, Homo habilis, all the way to a common ancestor with all primates. There are no sudden insertions of novel genetic sequences that can't be accounted for through natural evolutionary processes and occasional hybridization with other hominid species like Neanderthals and Denisovans. If the Anunnaki genetically engineered modern humans 300,000 years ago, we should see clear genetic evidence of that intervention. We don't. Fourth, the claim lost abilities aren't actually lost in a genetic sense. The genes that could enable longer lifespans still exist in human populations. The pineal gland still functions and produces its neurochemicals. The capacity for enhanced healing, for cognitive development, for intuitive abilities, all of these remain latent in human biology. They are not expressed the way they might have been in the past, but the underlying genetic potential remains. This suggests that environmental and cultural factors, not genetic manipulation, explain any changes in human capabilities over time. We're not a diminished species, we're the same species living in different conditions and using our capabilities in different ways. The strongest argument against deliberate suppression is Occam's razor. The simplest explanation that accounts for the evidence is usually correct. We don't need ancient astronauts, genetic engineering, and multi-generational conspiracies to explain human development. Standard evolutionary biology, cultural evolution, and well-understood environmental and dietary factors account for everything we observe. The alternative theories require us to accept extraordinary claims. Extraterrestrial visitors, advanced genetic engineering 300,000 years ago, ongoing suppression of human abilities through subtle mechanisms maintained for millennia. Each of these claims individually requires substantial evidence. Together, they require overwhelming evidence. And that evidence doesn't exist, so where does that leave us? With stories. Remarkably consistent stories across multiple cultures describing a time when humans lived longer, were stronger, had abilities we've lost, stories of divine beings who created us for a purpose. Stories of a catastrophic reset that changed the rules of human existence. Those stories mean something. They are not arbitrary fantasies, but what they mean remains open to interpretation. Are they distorted memories of real events? Are they psychological archetypes, deep truths about the human condition expressed through mythological narrative? Are they cultural artifacts that reveal how ancient people made sense of their world? The scientific consensus says they're mythology. Powerful, meaningful, culturally significant mythology, but not literal history. And yet the stories persist. The questions remain. Why do we seem to use only a fraction of our cognitive potential? Why do abilities manifest in some individuals that seem to transcend normal human limitations, Why do ancient accounts describe capabilities we can barely imagine? Why does it feel to many people like we're shadows of what we could be? Before we explore how to reclaim lost abilities, we need to address one of the most perplexing discoveries in modern genetics. A finding so anomalous that it's been quietly acknowledged in scientific literature, but rarely discussed in popular science. In the human genome, there are 23 genes that appear nowhere else in the tree of life. They exist in humans and only in humans. They have no obvious precursors in any other species, including our closest genetic relatives. When the Human Genome Project was completed in 2003, scientists expected to find that most human genes had clear evolutionary ancestors, that we could trace each gene back through chimpanzees, earlier primates, mammals, vertebrates, all the way to single-celled organisms, and for the vast majority of our genome, that's exactly what they found. Our genes have evolutionary histories. They mutated from earlier versions in ancestral species, sometimes through duplication events where a gene gets copied and the copy evolves new functions, sometimes through horizontal gene transfer where genetic material jumps between species through viral vectors. But 223 genes couldn't be traced to any precursor. They appeared to have been inserted into the human genome from outside the normal evolutionary tree. The official scientific explanation, published in peer-reviewed journals, is that these genes were likely acquired through horizontal gene transfer from bacteria. That at some point in our evolutionary past, bacterial DNA was incorporated into the germline, the reproductive cells that pass genetic information to offspring, and these bacterial genes became permanent parts of the human genome. This does happen. Viruses and bacteria can insert genetic material into host genomes. About 8% of the human genome consists of endogenous retroviruses, ancient viral infections that became permanent passengers in our DNA. So bacterial gene transfer isn't impossible. It's just extremely rare in complex organisms, and having 223 distinct bacterial genes successfully integrated and maintained is, statistically, extraordinarily unlikely. Moreover, when you examine what these 223 genes do, they are not random metabolic functions you might expect from bacterial insertions. Many of them are involved in complex neurological functions, cellular signaling, and regulatory processes that are distinctly important to what makes humans human. They're not evolutionary baggage. They're active, functional, and relevant. Alternative researchers, including those who support the ancient astronaut hypothesis, point to these 23 genes as potential evidence of genetic engineering. If you wanted to upgrade a hominid species to create something new, you would need to insert novel genetic information. You couldn't rely on random mutation and natural selection alone, because those processes are too slow and too random. You would need to add specific genes that code for the capabilities you want. The mainstream scientific community doesn't seriously entertain this interpretation. The bacterial horizontal transfer explanation, while imperfect, is more parsimonious than invoking extraterrestrial genetic engineers. But the fact remains, we have 23 genes that, from a strictly evolutionary standpoint, shouldn't be there, and we don't have a fully satisfactory explanation for how they got there. There's another genetic mystery that compounds this puzzle. The human chromosome too. All great apes have 12 pairs of chromosomes. Humans have 23 pairs. We're missing a chromosome, or rather we're not missing it. It's been fused. Human chromosome 2 is the result of an end-to-end fusion of two smaller ape chromosomes. We can see the fusion site, we can identify the remnants of telomeres, the protective caps that normally exist only at chromosome ends, buried in the middle of chromosome 2 where the fusion occurred. We can see the remnants of two separate centromeres, the structures that normally exist once per chromosome, with one centromere deactivated. This fusion is accepted scientific fact. The question is why it happened. Natural chromosome fusions occur occasionally in lower populations. Usually they're lethal or cause severe genetic problems. For a fusion to become fixed in an entire species, it has to provide some advantage or at least not cause problems, and it has to occur in the germline of an individual who then successfully reproduces and whose descendants eventually replace the non-fused population. The odds of this happening naturally are low. Not impossible, but improbable enough that some researchers have questioned whether the fusion might have been deliberately induced. If you wanted to create a genetic barrier between an engineered species and its wild-type ancestors, ensuring they couldn't interbreed successfully, engineering a chromosome fusion would be an elegant solution. A human with 23 chromosome pairs trying to reproduce with an ape with 24 pairs would face chromosomal incompatibility issues. The resulting offspring would likely have developmental problems or be sterile. It's a built-in reproductive barrier, preventing the engineered species from back-crossing with the species it was derived from. Again, mainstream science has a perfectly adequate natural explanation. Chromosome fusions happen. This one happened to an early human ancestor. It didn't cause her problems. It spread through the population. End of story. But if you're looking for evidence of deliberate genetic modification, a species-defining chromosome fusion would be exactly the kind of structural change you'd expect to see. Beyond the Sumerian accounts, other ancient traditions explicitly describe humanity as diminished from an earlier, greater state. These aren't vague hints, they're direct statements that humans used to be more capable and that something fundamental changed. The Hindu Vedic texts describe 4 ages or yugas. The Satya Yuga, or Golden Age, when humans lived for 100,000 years, possessed all virtues naturally and had direct connection to divine consciousness. Physical and mental abilities were at their peak. Disease didn't exist. Conflict was unknown. The Treta Yuga, when lifespan dropped to 10,000 years and virtue began to diminish slightly. The Dvapara Yuga, when lifespan fell to 1,000 years and vice began to appear in the world. And finally the Kali Yuga, the current Dark Age, when humans live barely at a century, virtue is rare, and consciousness is at its most limited. These aren't described as metaphorical ages. The texts treat them as literal historical periods, documenting a progressive decline in human capability across vast spans of time. The ages are measured in thousands or hundreds of thousands of years, far exceeding conventional historical timelines, but the pattern is clear. Humanity is in decline. What we are now is a shadow of what we once were. The Vedic texts also describe specific abilities that ancient humans possessed. Siddhis, or supernatural powers, that included telepathy, clairvoyance, levitation, materialization, the ability to become extremely small or large, the power to become light as air or heavy as a mountain, and the capacity to travel between dimensions. These weren't rare gifts possessed by a few mystics. They were natural abilities that advanced spiritual practitioners could develop through yoga and meditation. The texts describe these abilities as arising from the awakening of Kundalini energy, visualized as a coiled serpent at the base of the spine that, when activated, rises through energy centers called chakras, ultimately reaching the crown of the head and producing enlightenment and supernatural abilities. Modern science dismisses this as spiritual mythology, poetic descriptions of altered states of consciousness with no objective reality. But it's interesting to note that the physiological descriptions in these ancient texts align remarkably well with modern neuroscience. The chakras correspond to actual nerve plexuses and endocrine glands along the spine and in the brain. The description of energy rising from the base of the spine to the crown matches the pathway of cerebrospinal fluid and the activation sequence of various brain regions during deep meditation states. The pineal gland associated with the crown chakra produces DMT during intense meditative states, potentially explaining the vivid visionary experiences described in the texts. What if the Vedic siddhis aren't fantasy but descriptions of what an optimally functioning human nervous system can do? What if these abilities were common in ancient populations before environmental toxins, dietary changes, and cultural programming suppressed them? The Hebrew Bible describes the Nephilim, often translated as giants, who existed before the flood. Genesis 6 states explicitly that the sons of God came to the daughters of humans and had children with them. These children became the heroes of old, warriors of renown. The text treats this as historical fact, not allegory. These beings possessed capabilities far beyond normal humans. They were physically larger, stronger, and according to extra-biblical texts like the Book of Enoch, they had access to forbidden knowledge taught to them by the fallen angels who sired them. The Book of Enoch, excluded from the biblical canon but preserved in Ethiopian Orthodox tradition and found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, provides extensive detail about these beings. It describes how the Watchers, a group of angels descended to Mount Hermon, swore an oath to take human wives, and then taught humanity forbidden knowledge. Metalworking, weapons smithing, cosmetics, sorcery, astrology, and the secrets of heaven and earth. The offspring of these unions, the Nephilim, grew to enormous size and consumed vast quantities of resources. When those resources ran out, they began consuming humans. God's decision to send the flood was directly prompted by the corruption these hybrid beings had introduced into the world. The flood was meant to erase them and give humanity a fresh start. After the flood, the Nephilim reappear briefly in the biblical narrative. When the Israelites scout the land of Canaan, they report seeing the descendants of Anak, described as coming from the Nephilim. The scouts say, "We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them." This indicates beings of such size and power that normal humans appeared tiny by comparison. The existence of the Nephilim is treated matter-of-factly in the biblical text. They're not mythological creatures. They're a distinct population that existed, caused problems, was mostly destroyed in the flood, and then reappeared in diminished form afterward. If we take this literally, it suggests that the pre-flood world contained hybrid beings with capabilities far exceeding normal humans, and that the flood served as a filtering mechanism to remove them. Greek mythology describes a similar progression. The golden race created by the gods who lived like gods themselves, free from toil and grief, never aging, possessing strength and beauty, until they passed away as though falling asleep. Then the silver race, inferior to the first, who took 100 years to reach maturity and lived only a short time as adults because they couldn't control their passions. Then the bronze race, terrible and strong, who loved war and violence and destroyed themselves. Then the heroic race, the demigods who fought at Troy and Thebes, some of whom were transported to the Isles of the Blessed while others died in battle. And finally the iron race, the current age, marked by toil, misery and moral degradation. Again, this isn't presented as allegory. It's treated as the actual history of humanity, a sequence of distinct populations, each inferior to the last. The pattern is identical to the Sumerian king list, the Vedic yugas, and the biblical account. Humans used to be greater. Something happened. We declined. Egyptian mythology speaks of the Zep Tepi, the first time when gods walked the earth and ruled directly over humanity. During this period, humans lived in a state of harmony and possessed knowledge that was later lost. The pharaohs were considered direct descendants of these divine rulers, carrying diminished but still potent divine blood. The further you go back in Egyptian chronology, the more magical and extraordinary the accounts become. The earliest rulers performed miracles, commanded nature, and possessed wisdom far exceeding normal human understanding. Chinese legends describe the 3 sovereigns and 5 emperors, semi-divine or fully divine rulers from the distant past who taught humanity agriculture, medicine, writing, and the arts of civilization. They possessed extraordinary lifespans, supernatural abilities, and direct connection to heaven. Emperor Huangdi, the Yellow Emperor, supposedly ruled for over 100 years, invented numerous technologies, and ultimately ascended to heaven on a dragon. Across every major ancient culture, from Mesopotamia to India, from the Mediterranean to East Asia, from the Americas to Africa, you find the same narrative pattern. Humanity began with direct connection to divine or highly advanced beings. Those beings or their hybrid offspring possessed extraordinary capabilities. Over time, through a catastrophe, a flood, or a gradual decline, those capabilities were lost. Modern humans are the diminished descendants of far greater ancestors. Either this represents a universal psychological archetype, a collective human need to imagine a lost golden age, or it's the fragmented memory of real events, distorted through thousands of years of oral tradition and cultural evolution, but retaining the essential truth underneath the mythological elaboration. Every mention of diminished human capabilities is associated with a flood event. The Sumerian king list places it between the antediluvian super-long reigns and the post-diluvian shorter ones. Genesis places it between the patriarchs who lived 900 years and their descendants who lived progressively shorter lives. The Vedic tradition associates the shift between yugas with periodic destructions, including massive floods. Greek myths describe multiple catastrophic floods that reset civilization. Geology and archaeology have found extensive evidence of massive flooding events in human history. The end of the last ice age, around 11,600 years ago, involved rapid melting of glaciers and significant sea level rise. The Black Sea flood hypothesis suggests that the Mediterranean breached the Bosporus Strait around 57,600 BCE, transforming a freshwater lake into the Black Sea and inundating coastal settlements. Massive megafloods occurred repeatedly as glacial dams broke and released huge volumes of water. But the floods described in ancient texts seem to be more than just water. They are described as cosmic events, resets of reality itself. In the Sumerian account, the Anunnaki gods themselves are terrified by the flood, cowering at the highest point of heaven. In the biblical account, the flood is described as the fountains of the great deep bursting forth and the windows of heaven opening, suggesting not just rain but a fundamental disruption of the cosmic order. Some researchers have proposed that these accounts might be describing something other than a literal flood. A catastrophic event that was experienced and remembered as a flood because water was one obvious effect, but that involved much larger changes to the planet or even to reality itself. One theory involves a pole shift, a rapid change in Earth's magnetic field or rotational axis that would cause massive climate disruption, earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, and yes, tsunamis and flooding, but would also create widespread electromagnetic effects, disruption of circadian rhythms, and potential neurological impacts on all life. If the Earth's magnetic field suddenly weakened or shifted, cosmic radiation would increase dramatically. This could cause genetic mutations, damage to DNA, and potential activation or deactivation of genetic sequences. Another theory suggests a massive solar event, a coronal mass ejection or solar storm of unprecedented magnitude that stripped away part of Earth's atmosphere, caused global wildfires, and disrupted the planet's electromagnetic environment. Ancient accounts describe the sky burning, the sun becoming dark, the stars falling from heaven, all of which could be descriptions of atmospheric phenomena associated with a massive solar event. A third theory, more aligned with the ancient astronaut hypothesis, suggests the flood was a deliberately engineered reset, that the Anunnaki, observing that their genetic creation had gotten out of control, perhaps through interbreeding with the Watchers or through spontaneous genetic changes, decided to start over. They used their technology to trigger a catastrophe, perhaps by manipulating Earth's orbit, disrupting the ice caps, or employing weapons we can barely conceive, and then carefully preserve genetic samples of the humans they wanted to continue, while allowing the old population to be destroyed. The biblical account of Noah's Ark explicitly describes preserving breeding pairs of animals and a single human family. If you wanted to perform a genetic bottleneck on the human population, to eliminate unwanted genetic variants and restart with only the lineages you approve, that's exactly how you do it. Preserve the genetic material you want, destroy everything else and repopulate from the preserved samples. The post-flood world, in this interpretation, is humanity 2.0. The same basic species, but with specific genetic modifications, shorter lifespans, reduced cognitive abilities, diminished access to psychic faculties, built-in limitations that weren't present in the original model. All ancient traditions agree that after the flood something fundamental changed. The direct connection between humans and the divine was severed or severely attenuated. Lifespans crashed. The age of heroes ended. Civilization had to rebuild from scratch, starting over with a population that possessed less capability than their antediluvian ancestors. Whether this was a natural catastrophe that eliminated the most advanced populations and left only scattered survivors, or a deliberate culling designed to reset the human experiment, the result was the same. The world after the flood was diminished, and we are the descendants of that diminished population. If humans used to be larger, stronger, and more capable, we should find physical evidence. And we do, though it's fragmented and controversial. Archaeological sites worldwide have yielded skeletal remains that don't fit comfortably into the standard human size range. Reports of giant skeletons, individuals 7, 8, even 10 feet tall, appear in archaeological literature from the 18th and 19th centuries. Many of these reports come from Native American burial mounds excavated in the United States. Others come from Europe, South America, and the Middle East. The Smithsonian Institution and other major museums are often accused of having suppressed this evidence, of deliberately hiding or destroying giant skeletons because they contradict the established narrative of human evolution. The conspiracy theory claims that hundreds of giant skeletons were excavated, documented in local newspapers and initial archaeological reports, and then vanished into museum basements, never to be displayed or studied by the independent researchers. The mainstream response is that these reports were either hoaxes, misidentifications of normal human remains that appeared larger due to poor excavation techniques, or simply exaggerations. A 7-foot skeleton is unusual but not impossible. Modern humans occasionally reach that height. Without proper archaeological context and modern dating and analysis techniques, it's hard to distinguish an unusually tall individual from a member of a distinct giant population. However, there are some cases that are harder to dismiss. In 1912, archaeologists excavating Lovelock Cave in Nevada found multiple mummified remains of red-haired individuals who, according to measurements recorded at the time, range from 6 to 8 feet tall. The local Paiute tribe had legends of a red-haired giant race called the Si-Te-Kai, who were eventually exterminated by a coalition of tribes after centuries of conflict. The physical remains seemed to match the legends. Most of these remains have since disappeared, or been reburied under Native American repatriation laws, making independent verification impossible. But the initial reports and photographs suggest that something anomalous was found. In 2004, Indonesian researchers announced the discovery of Homo floresiensis, dubbed hobbits, a species of small-bodied humans that lived on the island of Flores until about 50,000 years ago. Adults stood only about 3.5 feet tall. This proved that distinct human populations with significantly different body sizes could exist in relative isolation and survive for long periods. If dwarfism can evolve in isolated populations, gigantism should be equally possible. Perhaps the reports of giants aren't describing a separate species, but rather isolated populations of Homo sapiens, who through genetic drift or specific environmental pressures evolved larger body sizes. These populations would have been rare and may have gone extinct, leaving only scattered skeletal remains and the mythological accounts of people who encountered them. The alternative interpretation is that the giants weren't a natural variation, but the Nephilim, the hybrid offspring of the Anunnaki or Watchers and human women. These beings would have inherited genetic material that coded for larger size, greater strength, extended lifespan, and potentially other abilities from their non-human parent. They would have been distinct from normal humans, biologically superior in many ways, and threatening to the Anunnaki plan for controlled humanity. After the flood eliminated most of them, the few that remained or were recreated gradually died out as their non-human genetic heritage diluted through interbreeding with normal humans, or as they were specifically targeted and exterminated, which is exactly what the biblical account describes happening to the Anakim and other giant populations in Canaan. Whether human abilities were deliberately suppressed by ancient genetic engineers or simply atrophied through environmental and cultural changes, the practical question remains the same. Can we reclaim them? The answer appears to be yes, at least partially, because unlike genetic changes that require millions of years to reverse, environmental and epigenetic changes can be addressed within a single lifetime. The field of epigenetics has revealed that genes can be switched on or off without changing the underlying DNA sequence. Environmental factors, dietary choices, stress levels, meditation practices, and even thoughts and beliefs can influence which genes are expressed and which remain dormant. This means that capabilities encoded in our DNA but suppressed through environmental or cultural factors can potentially be reactivated within a single generation. Consider the documented cases of extreme human performance that seem to transcend normal limitations. Wim Hof, the Dutch extreme athlete, can control his autonomic nervous system through breathing techniques and meditation, surviving in temperatures that should cause hypothermia, influencing his immune response to injected pathogens, and training others to do the same. Scientific studies have confirmed that he's actually doing what he claims, activating physiological systems that medical science believed were entirely autonomous and beyond conscious control. Tibetan monks practicing Tummo meditation can raise their core body temperature enough to dry wet sheets wrapped around their naked bodies in freezing conditions. This isn't mythology. It's been documented and studied by Western scientists. The monks aren't using magic. They're using specific breathing and visualization techniques that activate neurological and metabolic pathways most people never access. Memory champions can memorize entire shuffled decks of cards in under a minute. Thousands of random digits. Enormous amounts of information that should exceed the capacity of human working memory. They are not born with supermemory. They train specific mental techniques that exploit the brain's natural capacity for spatial and visual memory, demonstrating that the limits we assume are absolute are actually just the limits of our current usage patterns. These examples prove that the human nervous system has capabilities far beyond what we typically access. The genetics are there, the neurology is there. What's missing is the knowledge of how to activate these systems and the cultural framework that encourages people to try. In the context of potentially reclaiming suppressed abilities, several practical approaches have emerged, drawing from both ancient wisdom traditions and modern scientific understanding. First, optimizing the internal biological environment. This involves removing the toxins and environmental factors that interfere with optimal neurological and physiological function. Filtering fluoride from drinking water. Choosing organic whole foods over processed products laden with additives and preservatives. Reducing exposure to heavy metals through careful sourcing of food and water. Minimizing electromagnetic radiation exposure by limiting time with wireless devices and creating low EMF sleeping environments. These aren't fringe health practices. They're increasingly supported by mainstream research showing that environmental toxins do accumulate in brain tissue, do interfere with endocrine function, and do have measurable negative effects on cognition and health. Removing them doesn't confer supernatural abilities, but it removes impediments to optimal function. Second, actively stimulating dormant capacities through specific practices. Meditation has been extensively studied and shown to produce measurable changes in brain structure and function. Long-term meditators show increased thickness in brain regions associated with attention and sensory processing, enhanced connectivity between brain networks, and the ability to enter altered states of consciousness at will. These aren't subjective experiences, they're objective, measurable neurological changes. Breathwork practices, from ancient pranayama techniques to modern Wim Hof method, can profoundly alter physiology, shifting the balance between sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems, changing blood pH, increasing oxygen delivery to tissues, and potentially producing altered states through controlled hypoxia and hyperoxia. Sensory deprivation, whether through flotation tanks or meditation, removes external stimuli and allows the brain to enter unusual states where the boundary between self and environment becomes permeable, often leading to experiences that users describe as psychic or mystical. The neuroscience of these states is being actively researched, with findings suggesting that reducing sensory input causes the brain to generate internal perceptual experiences that can feel more real than external reality. Third, deliberately training abilities that most people believe don't exist. Telepathy experiments conducted seriously and systematically over extended periods with people who are emotionally close sometimes yield results slightly but consistently above chance. The effect sizes are small and the phenomena are maddeningly inconsistent, but meta-analyses of thousands of experimental trials show a small but statistically significant effect that can't be explained by chance or experimental artifacts. This doesn't prove telepathy in the dramatic science fiction sense. It suggests something subtler, that information might be able to transfer between minds through mechanisms we don't yet understand, especially between people with strong emotional bonds. If this capacity exists in rudimentary form, it might be developable through practice. Remote viewing, the attempt to psychically perceive distant locations, was studied extensively by military intelligence agencies. The protocols were rigorous, the results were mixed, but some viewers consistently performed above chance levels, though never with the reliability or accuracy needed for practical intelligence gathering. The programs were eventually shut down not because they proved impossible, but because they proved unreliable. Again, this suggests a real but weak and inconsistent ability that might be latent in human neurology, but is difficult to access and develop under our current cultural and environmental conditions. Fourth, using technology and pharmacology to enhance baseline human capabilities. Nootropics, cognitive enhancement drugs, range from simple caffeine to sophisticated pharmaceutical compounds that modulate neurotransmitter system. Some people report significant improvements in focus, memory, and cognitive endurance. Others find little benefit. The variability suggests that these compounds are interacting with complex individual differences in neurochemistry, and that optimal cognitive function might require personalized interventions. Neurofeedback and brain stimulation technologies allow people to train specific brainwave patterns associated with peak performance states. Athletes use these tools to learn to enter flow states. Meditators use them to accelerate their progress toward deep concentration. Trauma survivors use them to regulate hyperactive fear circuits. The technology is allowing us to develop more conscious control over the brain states that were previously automatic and inaccessible. Genetic technologies, still in early development but advancing rapidly, may eventually allow us to make permanent changes to our genomes, activating beneficial variants, silencing harmful ones, or even inserting entirely novel genes designed to enhance specific capabilities. This technology is decades away from being safe and effective for cognitive and physiological enhancement in humans, but the trajectory is clear. We're moving toward the ability to directly edit our own genetic code. All of these approaches, whether ancient practices or cutting-edge science, are working toward the same goal: expanding human potential beyond its current expression. And the remarkable thing is that it's working. Not dramatically, not producing the overnight transformations promised by sensational claims, but steadily. Incrementally, we're learning to access capabilities that most people never develop. The question isn't whether these capabilities exist. The question is why they're not standard. Why aren't all humans telepathic? Why can't everyone control their autonomic nervous system? Why does optimal cognitive function require special training and tools rather than being the default state? If we were deliberately engineered as a limited species, these would be exactly the kinds of limitations you'd expect to see. Capabilities present in the genetics and neurology but suppressed, difficult to access, requiring significant effort to develop, and constantly undermined by environmental and cultural factors. If we're simply the product of natural evolution shaped for survival in ancestral environments, rather than for accessing supernatural abilities, then the limitations make sense too. Evolution doesn't care about psychic powers, it cares about reproduction. If normal human capabilities were sufficient for our ancestors to survive and reproduce, there would be no evolutionary pressure to develop anything more. Both frameworks lead to the same practical conclusion. If you want to develop these capabilities, you have to work against the current default state. You have to actively pursue practices that your genes, your environment, and your culture don't naturally encourage. You have to become a deliberate self-experimenter, treating your own consciousness and physiology as a frontier to be explored. And that exploration is happening. Thousands, perhaps millions of people worldwide are working to decalcify their pineal glands, develop their psychic abilities, extend their health span, enhance their cognition, and generally push the boundaries of what human beings can do and experience. The results are still preliminary, but they suggest that whatever limitations currently exist, whether imposed by ancient genetic engineers or by natural evolutionary processes, they're not absolute, they're malleable, and with enough knowledge, effort, and time, they can be transcended. Decalcifying the pineal gland is a process many people are actively pursuing. It involves reducing exposure to fluoride by filtering drinking water and using fluoride-free dental products, avoiding processed foods with calcium phosphate additives, supplementing with nutrients that help remove heavy metals and calcium deposits, things like iodine, magnesium, chlorella, spirulina, cilantro, and certain fulvic and humic acids. Reducing electromagnetic exposure where possible, particularly during sleep when the pineal gland is most active. And most importantly, actively working to stimulate the gland through meditation, breathwork, and practices specifically designed to activate the third eye. Some practitioners report following specific protocols that combine dietary changes with daily meditation, focusing on the space between the eyebrows, visualization exercises involving indigo light, chanting specific tones believed to resonate with the pineal gland's frequency, and using essential oils like sandalwood and frankincense that traditional texts associate with spiritual awakening. Reports from people who've successfully decalcified their pineal glands are anecdotal, but remarkably consistent across cultures and individuals who have no contact with each other. They describe experiencing more vivid dreams, often lucid dreams where they're aware they're dreaming, and can consciously navigate the dream environment. Enhanced intuition. Stronger gut feeling about situations and people that proves accurate more often than chance would predict. Occasional telepathic connections with people they're emotionally close to. Moments where they think of someone and that person immediately calls, or where they and a partner simultaneously say the same unusual phrase. A sense of expanded awareness and connection to something larger than their individual consciousness. A feeling of being part of an interconnected field of consciousness that extends beyond the physical brain. Whether these are genuine psychic abilities emerging or neurochemical changes that alter subjective experience in ways that feel like psychic abilities is debatable. Skeptics would argue it's the latter, that changes in melatonin and DMT production create altered states of consciousness that feel meaningful, but have no objective reality beyond the person experiencing them. Believers would counter that the objective-subjective distinction might be less clear than materialist science assumes, that consciousness itself might be a fundamental feature of reality rather than an epiphenomenon of neural activity, and that these subjective experiences might be accessing real information through non-physical channels. But regardless of interpretation, the subjective experience is real to the people having it, and subjective experience, one could argue, is the only experience any of us ever has. Everything you know about external reality is mediated through consciousness. You don't experience the world directly. You experience your brain's reconstruction of sensory data, filtered through your expectations, beliefs, and past experiences. In that sense, an expanded or altered consciousness that reveals new patterns and connections might be just as valid a way of knowing as the narrowly focused, analytical consciousness we typically operate from. Extending health span and possibly lifespan is an active area of cutting-edge scientific research. We're identifying the genes and molecular pathways involved in aging. The FOXO3 gene and its variants that correlate with exceptional longevity. The AMPK pathway that regulates cellular energy and metabolism. The sirtuins, a family of proteins involved in cellular stress resistance. The mTOR pathway that regulates cell growth and senescence. We're developing interventions, pharmaceutical, genetic, and lifestyle-based, that show genuine promise in animal models for extending not just lifespan, but health span, the period of life spent in good health. Caloric restriction without malnutrition extends lifespan in nearly every organism studied, from yeast to primates. Intermittent fasting produces similar benefits through different mechanisms, triggering cellular autophagy where cells break down and recycle damaged components. Specific exercise protocols, particularly high-intensity interval training, activate longevity pathways and maintain stem cell populations. Certain pharmaceutical compounds like rapamycin and metformin show lifespan extension in animal models by modulating metabolic pathways, though their use in healthy humans for longevity purposes is still experimental and controversial. We're also exploring more radical interventions. Senolytics, drugs that selectively destroy senescent cells that accumulate with age and contribute to tissue dysfunction and inflammation. Telomerase activation to prevent or reverse the shortening of chromosome-protecting telomeres that occurs with each cell division. Partial cellular reprogramming using Yamanaka factors to reset cells to a younger epigenetic state without dedifferentiating them completely into stem cells. NAD+ supplementation to restore levels of this crucial cellular coenzyme that declines with age and is necessary for DNA repair and metabolic function. These interventions are in various stages of research and development. Some are available now but with uncertain long-term safety profiles. Others are years or decades away from human application, but the trajectory is clear. We're not going to see 900-year lifespans in the near future. The engineering challenges are too complex, and there are hard limits imposed by physics, entropy, and the accumulation of random damage to biological systems. But extending healthy human lifespan to 120, 150, possibly even 200 years may be achievable within the next few generations if research continues and funding remains available. We're working to undo whatever diminishment occurred, whether it was deliberate genetic engineering to limit our lifespans or simply the natural result of evolutionary trade-offs and environmental changes. The irony is that modern science, working from a materialist framework that denies any possibility of ancient genetic engineering, is nevertheless pursuing the same goal that the ancient texts suggest was taken from us. We're trying to make ourselves live longer, think clearer, heal faster, and access expanded states of consciousness. We're trying to become more than we currently are. We're trying to reclaim abilities that the myths say we once had. Cognitive enhancement is another frontier. Nootropics, compounds that enhance cognitive function, are becoming increasingly sophisticated. Techniques like meditation and mindfulness training demonstrably increase neuroplasticity and cognitive capacity. Memory training systems allow people to develop abilities that seem superhuman, memorizing thousands of digits, entire decks of cards, vast amounts of information. These aren't new genetic capabilities. They're the full expression of what human neurology can already do, given the right training and tools. Physical enhancement through optimized training, nutrition, and increasingly through genetic and pharmaceutical interventions is creating humans who are far stronger, faster, and more resilient than the average person. Elite athletes are pushing the boundaries of what we thought human bodies could achieve. None of this requires alien technology or recovered ancient knowledge. It's being done through rigorous application of modern science. But it's accomplishing what the ancient myths described, creating humans with capabilities far beyond the average, awakening dormant potential, reclaiming abilities that most people never develop. The question is whether we're simply developing natural human potential or whether we're actually reversing ancient suppression. And the answer might be both. As your breathing slows and your thoughts drift towards sleep, let's sit with the deepest question this investigation raises, not whether the Anunnaki were real or whether our abilities were suppressed, but what it means to be human in the first place. If the materialist scientific view is correct, we're the product of billions of years of evolution, shaped by natural selection into conscious beings capable of understanding our own origins. We're self-aware patterns of matter and energy, temporary configurations of atoms that will eventually dissipate back into the cosmos. Our consciousness is an emergent property of neurological complexity. Our sense of purpose is an illusion created by survival drives. We're alone in the universe until proven otherwise. This view is neither comforting nor despairing. It simply is what the evidence suggests, and there's a certain austere beauty in it. We're the universe becoming conscious of itself. We're stardust that learned to think. We're a brief flame of awareness in an immense cosmic dark. But the alternative view, the one suggested by ancient myths and embraced by various spiritual and esoteric traditions, is that we're more than biological machines. That consciousness isn't produced by the brain, but rather channeled through it. That we're spiritual beings having a temporary physical experience. That the material world is one layer of a multidimensional reality we can't fully perceive with our limited senses. In this view, the suppression of human abilities isn't primarily genetic, it's perceptual. We've been limited not in our biology, but in our awareness. We've been taught to identify with the physical form, with the thoughts and emotions generated by our neurology, rather than with the deeper consciousness that observes those thoughts and emotions. We've been conditioned to perceive only the material dimension and to dismiss everything else as imagination or delusion. The real suppression, in this framework, is the forgetting of what we truly are. We're infinite consciousness experiencing limitation. We're divine sparks encased in flesh, playing a cosmic game of forgetting and remembering. And the purpose of the entire exercise is the journey back to remembering. The Anunnaki, in this interpretation, aren't necessarily physical extraterrestrials. They could be beings from higher dimensions, consciousness operating at frequencies we can't normally perceive. Their genetic engineering might not have been biological manipulation, but rather the imposition of perceptual filters, limiting human consciousness to focus on the physical dimension and blocking access to higher awareness. The flood that divides the antediluvian from the post-diluvian wouldn't be water but a shift in consciousness, a dimensional reset that changed the rules of reality and made it much harder for embodied consciousness to maintain connection with the higher frequencies. Reclaiming lost abilities in this view isn't about reversing genetic changes, it's about remembering how to perceive and operate in dimensions beyond the physical. It's about reactivating dormant aspects of consciousness that have been asleep for millennia. Both frameworks, the materialist and the spiritual, are internally consistent. Both account for the evidence, though they interpret it very differently. Both offer paths forward for human development. The choice between them isn't one of right and wrong, it's one of resonance. Which framework feels true to you? Which one makes your experience of being human make sense? And here's the deepest secret. It might not be a choice at all. Reality might be large enough to contain both. We might be simultaneously biological machines shaped by evolution and immortal consciousness experiencing limitation. We might be both the product of natural processes and the creation of higher intelligence. We might be diminished from what we were, and also exactly what we're meant to be at this stage of our development. The ancient Sumerians, writing on their clay tablets under the stars of Mesopotamia, may have been recording myths, or they may have been documenting genuine history in the only vocabulary they had. We stand too far from those events to know with certainty, but we're close enough to our own experience to know this. You are more than you've been taught to believe. Your consciousness is vaster than your thoughts. Your potential is greater than what you've been told is possible. And somewhere in your genetic code, in your neurology, in your consciousness itself, capabilities sleep that could wake if you knew how to call them. Whether those capabilities were placed there by evolutionary processes, by genetic engineers from another world, or by your own higher self before you incarnated into this particular form, the result is the same. They are all there, Dormant, but not dead. Waiting. The question isn't what the Anunnaki did to us thousands of years ago. The question is what you'll do with the seed of potential they, or evolution, or consciousness itself left within you. Will you accept the limitations you've been taught are absolute, or will you test them? Will you assume your current state is all you can be, or will you explore the edges of what's possible? The clay tablets in museum drawers can't answer these questions for you. The genetic sequences in your DNA won't make the choice. The ancient myths point toward mysteries but don't solve them. Only you can decide who and what you're willing to become, and with that thought, let everything else drift away. The Anunnaki and their agendas, the question of what was lost, the possibility of what could be reclaimed. All of it can wait. All of it will still be there tomorrow if you want to explore further. For now, there's only this moment. Your breath moving in and out. Your consciousness floating between waking and sleep. The vast quiet of the universe holding you in its ancient arms. The stories we've explored tonight, whether they're history or myth, all agree on one thing. You're here for a reason. You carry within you something precious, and the journey of discovering what that is has only just begun. So rest now. Let the questions dissolve. Let the mysteries remain mysterious. Let sleep come naturally, knowing that whatever you are, whatever capabilities sleep within you, they are not going anywhere. They've waited thousands of years. They can wait until morning. Until next time, wherever you are in the world, whatever time it is, sleep well, dream deep, and remember, just for a moment before you slip away completely, that you are so much more than you've been told. Good night.